Thank you very much for your very generous introduction. And a big thanks to Dr. Fayasa, librarian Allama Iqbal Library, for extending this invitation to me and having me here today. And I feel honored, as always, to share some knowledge with my students and scholars. And I will try to say something about philosophical roots of postmodernism. As you can see, this is the title of my talk. Postmodernism is now a term which is no longer new as it was a few decades ago. When I started looking for my research topic 23 years ago, postmodernism was still considered post, although it had already become old in the Western academia, but in this part of the world it was still considered to be something new, something exciting. And it took me some time to settle on a topic, and finally I chose a topic on postmodern British drama. And in order to understand art, I had to understand the philosophy of postmodernism, and that took me to the philosophers who are generally, categorized as postmodern thinkers and postmodern philosophers. Although you can very easily see that postmodern philosophy itself is a kind of oxymoron. In fact, a contradiction in terms, somewhat, because postmodernism is deeply anti-philosophical, in the sense that it very fundamentally challenges the very idea of philosophy as a pursuit of truth. That's why sometimes people call Derrida an anti-philosopher. But we need not be trapped by terms. Nietzsche is perhaps the greatest anti-philosopher, and still we read him as a philosopher and we call him a philosopher. So I will be going to some very basic ideas which I'm not sure, but I think that by now, 2026, with the kind of knowledge explosion that has taken place, and with the gadgets that everybody has all the time with them, at the click of the button you will get all that is written on postmodernism. As somebody has rightly said, that there is so much out there, but there are very few people to apply their minds to what exists all there, and to sift the authentic from the inauthentic and the spurious, and ultimately to assimilate what needs to be assimilated. So one suggestion to all students is that when you go to these sources, whether it is ChatGPT or whether it is Google or anything else, or even your electronic resources here, kindly be sure that what you are getting is authentic. It does not give you, because this is an age of misinformation also. You have to be very careful. So let me begin. One of the things that I found exasperating the moment I started doing my research was that postmodernism perhaps doesn't mean anything. You know why? Because it means so many things that it is hard to pin down what it means. And Terry Eagleton uses in one of his books, he uses this concept. He has a book on culture, and he says that one of the words in English language which is maddeningly hard to pin down is culture, because culture means so many things. From a school-going kid of third grade who would use this word culture to an established academic, the word culture is used everywhere, and yet it does not mean the same thing. It means so many things, depending on the context in which it is used. Postmodernism is one of such exasperating terms. In fact, some philosophers go on to say that it suffers from a kind of an inherent semantic instability. And Therefore, it becomes very hard to define what postmodernism is, and in fact, people would also call it is indefinable. This is something similar to how Romanticism was defined in around 100 years ago, and when there were debates going on in the English-speaking world about what Romanticism is. This is something similar to that. If you remember, A.O. Lovejoy wrote an article, a very famous essay called On Romanticisms. And in On Romanticisms, he gives you so many different perspectives on Romanticism that you end up saying, oh, what is Romanticism? It ultimately, how can we actually mean, arrive at any definite meaning of Romanticism? But nonetheless, the term is used. And since humans have an inherent propensity, in fact, one could say that they have a necessity to fix meanings, we always run after some kind of fixity without which we cannot do. That is why doubt is the most painful thing for an intellectual. David Hume, in order to distract himself, used to play billiards very often in the evening, and when he was asked that why does he do so, he says that if I don't distract my mind, I fear that this doubt might eat me up. It might paralyze me. So doubt about things can be very, very painful, and that's why we try to go for things for which we have some kind of certainty. Okay. Now, as you know and rightly expect, I will be talking about most postmodernism from a particular point of view. I will be, in other words, talking about postmodernism as a philosophical concept. But this is not the only sense in which postmodernism is used. Patricia Waugh is a very well-known postmodern critic. She wrote a book in which she said that we can say that postmodernism is used broadly in three different senses. It is used to refer to a particular historical epoch, a historical period that started after modernism. It is also used for a particular kind of aesthetic practice that became dominant in that historical epoch, and it is also used as a philosophical concept. So I will be talking of postmodernism as a philosophical concept, not as an aesthetic category or an aesthetic practice, and not even as the historical, as a concept that as a term that relates to a particular historical period. Postmodernism as a philosophical concept, with the caveat that it is open to challenge and it is open to any kind of assault from anywhere you think is possible. Another thing that all students immediately grasp is post means something that comes after. So it already has within it some sense of a sense of something that that designates a period, a time, something that comes after modernism. And this is also a problem on which so much has been written. What is the relationship between postmodernism and modernism? And it reaches its point of bizarreness, let me call it, when Lyotard says that postmodernism does not come after modernism, it comes before modernism. It can't get madder than that. What that means, we will perhaps see someday what that means. But he does say that for any postmodernism to be, every postmodernism is to be followed by or is followed by modernism. Anyway, coming back to this point of what are the philosophical roots of postmodernism when we talk about it as a philosophical concept. And I will be talking about a few thinkers. My primary aim here would be to give you some kind of background today. Maybe in subsequent lectures we talk about actual postmodern thinkers. But in this sense of postmodernism as a philosophical concept, it is nothing new. It is nothing new. I'm saying this, I'm making this statement, and I'm careful, and I know that there could be people who might not agree with me. But as I see it, postmodernism in this sense is nothing new, because postmodernism is a continuation of that current in philosophical thinking that we knew in traditional times as skepticism. It is only that that skepticism becomes much more radical in postmodernism. So let us say that postmodernism as a philosophical concept is a radical epistemological skepticism. And here postmodernism is a continuation of something that we know already in ancient Greece, in medieval times, and also in modern times. So I will be saying something about that. But before I actually go into that, let me give you a few basic ideas that are often used to describe postmodernism. Postmodernism, says Loita, that is perhaps the most famous definition of postmodernism. Simplifying to the extreme, I define postmodernism as the incredulity towards all meta-narratives. This was a book that was written by Loitard in 1979. Remember this year, this 1979 is an important year in the history of postmodern thought, not only because this particular book was written, it was written in French, and it was only, I think, 5 years later that it was translated into English. And it was written, it was actually consigned by the Quebec government in Canada. And the English translation has a foreword written by Frederick Jameson, the great Marxist thinker who died a year or two ago, but who also wrote extensively on postmodernism, but from a different perspective, from a critical Marxist perspective. His one book that became very famous was called Postmodern or the Logic of Late Capitalism. It was in the beginning written as an essay, then it was expanded into a book. It is one of the most celebrated and one of the most important works on postmodernism in, in theory. So I said that 1979 is an important year because in this year Loitard writes his book, The Postmodern Condition. But there is another book that is written which we don't often hear about, and which is in fact more important from an academic point of view for those who are interested in postmodernism as philosophy. It is a book by Richard Rorty. It's called Philosophy and the Mirror of Nature. This book was an important book in the history of postmodernism because it presented an idea which is his American pragmatism, not the pragmatism of Charles Sanders Peirce or the pragmatism of the followers in the pragmatic tradition. America is used for just one school of philosophy, that is pragmatism. Peirce and William James and John Dewey and then Richard Rorty. Richard Rorty wrote this book, and it created a big, stir in the intellectual world at that time. Although, as I said, that not many people, not many students now read this book, but it is an important work because if you talk about a philosophical engagement with the tradition that Richard Rorty is out to attack and out to criticize, then you need to read that book. The basic thesis of that book is he's trying to engage with the tradition of the intellectual the philosophical tradition, beginning from Greeks with Plato and Aristotle. Plato and Aristotle are the two figures that he returns to again and again, but also modern philosophers like Descartes and Kant and others. So his basic thesis is that philosophy begins with by taking a wrong step, because it thinks that philosophy can produce knowledge about reality, mirror of nature. The idea that somehow knowledge, or what you call epistemology, mirrors the actual knowledge out there. So the entire book is a sustained critique of this basic premise in philosophy. But we are not going to talk about that book now. Maybe someday later we might talk about that book. We'll talk about the other book, which is the more popular and more famous one, which is Lyotard's The Postmodern Condition. In the postmodern condition, Lyotard says that, simplifying to the extreme, I define postmodernism as incredulity towards all meta-narratives. And then the question is that what is a meta-narrative? And then he says something about it. It is a lucid book, not very not very big, just I think 100 pages or so long, and it can be read in a few days. And it's not that difficult to understand Lyotard as reading Derrida or Foucault or even Frederick Jameson and some other postmodern writers. So this incredulity, that is, we refuse to accept those stories, those narratives which were there with us as narratives explaining the nature of reality to us. For example, the Great Enlightenment narrative was something that postmodern, according to Lyotard, postmoderns question. It is an incredulity towards the Enlightenment project or the Enlightenment narrative. What was that Enlightenment project or Enlightenment narrative? Just try to think of it. Just go back to the Enlightenment period. Enlightenment shook the Western world, and it also laid the foundations for a new world, as we know. What was this Enlightenment? This was a new awakening. It was called Aufklärung in Germany, and in German language. And in fact, Immanuel Kant did write an article answering the question, what is enlightenment? In which he said that enlightenment, mark his words, enlightenment is mankind awakening from its self-induced minority. Meaning that for all this time, it is as if mankind was asleep, or it is as if mankind was in that stage of minority. Suddenly it has attained maturity. That is enlightenment. And enlightenment thinkers stress this point, dare to think. Because if you do not think, nobody is going to think for you. Then what was this enlightenment narrative? The enlightenment narrative was that it was fundamentally a belief in the capacity of human reason. Human reason. That we can transform the world if we know how to use reason. If we know how to use reason, and then the second step is that knowledge will also empower us. This relationship between power and knowledge, which we today read in Foucault, it is not really so new, because Francis Bacon had already talked about the connection between knowledge and power. But in enlightenment, this was very clearly stressed. Knowledge would be the knowledge of the world, whatever knowledge there is, and that knowledge will not only enlighten us, not only illuminate us, but it will also make us powerful. For example, we will understand what nature is, how nature works. If we do not have the knowledge of nature, then we are superstitious. We live in an age of superstition then. And the only thing that actually differentiates us from those people who have pre-modern, or you could say superstitious views, is that they believe in nature as some kind of mysterious thing which they have to submit to. This is the same idea that you find in Auguste Comte, the father of sociology in the 19th century, who said that mankind actually has passed through several stages. We have passed through the first stage, which was the stage of metaphysical truths, or the theological stage. The theological stage is the stage of the supernatural, where natural events are always explained by reference to some supernatural idea. The reason that people worshipped sun and the moon and the thunder and the lightning and the fire and different manifestations of nature is that they did not understand it. We can very well imagine the pitiable condition of a peasant whose entire labor depended on rain and sunshine. He needed to propitiate those powers of nature, but he could not appease or propitiate those powers of nature unless he understood them. But he could not obviously understand what thunder was, what caused thunder, what is sun. He thought that sun is a god, he thought thunder is a god, and therefore man started worshipping nature and natural phenomena. But in comes science, and science demystifies this. Now, remember, this is an important concept, this is an important term, demystification. What is that science has done? Science has demystified nature. And this was precisely the danger that Romantics felt, that this demystification of nature is going to wreak havoc with us, because it's not going to stop anywhere. So they said that if science and Enlightenment thought has demystified nature, we need to remystify it. That's why one of the things that Romantics said, that they defined Romanticism as a renaissance of wonder. And if you want to see the connection between Romanticism and postmodernism, read a book by Patricia Waugh on postmodernism, reading postmodernism, practicing modernism. And she discusses this relationship between Romanticism and postmodernism, and how postmodernism brings in a new, packing the ideas that were already there in Romanticism. At least some of those ideas were already there in Romanticism. Okay, so Enlightenment project had this fundamental, you could say, impulse or fundamental orientation towards rationality. It is this project of rationality that comes under attack in postmodernism. But this is just one of the grand narratives. There are other grand narratives also. For example, Christian salvation history is another grand narrative. Philosophers till Hegel kept history out of their discussions, because philosophy was seen as something that had very little to do with history. Because philosophy is, it is a subject, which has a distinctness of its own, an importance of its own, and history is the mundane, and it is not really important for philosophers. It is a separate subject, but not for philosophers. Hegel changed that. One of the things that Hegel did was that he emphasized the importance of history, and he said that because he connects mind with reality. He says that the rational is the real and the real is the rational, which is to say that actually this entire human history is nothing but the unfolding of the Geist, of the spirit or the mind. And the two things are not really, they don't constitute two different things. They are two facets of the same thing. Anyway, this interpretation of history had the most profound effect on Marx. Hegel also believed that history is going somewhere. That's why we say that in Hegel we have a concept of telos, that is purpose. That is, history is going somewhere. History is not a mere random, a random series of events taking place without any order, without any inner logic. It is going somewhere. Where is it going to? It is ultimately going to end at a point where the absolute has completely realized itself. The end of history is the self-realization of the absolute. Okay, you already see that these are the ideas that were there in mystics. They were there in Ibn Arabi and many other mystics in the Christian world, and also in the Islamic world. That the reason that God created the universe was to let me put it like this. The reason that God created the world was, actually I should qualify this, because there are subtleties here. One of the subtleties is that there is an aesthetic erotic interpretation of why God created the universe, which says that, and this you find in Jami, for example. If you read Jami's Yusuf Zulaykha, in the prologue to Yusuf Zulaykha, Jami will give you a description of, because the story is about Yusuf's beauty and Zulaykha's love for his beauty. This is taken from the Quran, as you know, the story of Yusuf and Zulaykha. But Jami gives it a different interpretation altogether. He fits it in his sophistic metaphysics and speculative Sufism, and he says that why is it that the one had to create the other, which ultimately is not the other, which somehow arises from that one. And he gives this this relationship between beauty and love. To say it very simply for your sake, it is that God wanted to behold himself in a mirror, and the mirror that he created was the universe. It is as simple as I can put it. Okay, whatever you make it of it, that's your headache. So Hegel is saying that the end of history is, of course, for the absolute attaining self-realization. Now, in comes Marx, and Marx famously said that Hegel is standing on his head. I have to put it back. And Marx says that no, Hegelian dialectics is fine as a methodology to understand history, but he's basically wrong in thinking that history is nothing but a journey towards the self-realization of the absolute. So he says that everything is here and now, everything is material, because he's a materialist, and he thinks that the driving force in history is class struggle, human labor, human action. Why am I saying all this? Because at the time when Lyotard was writing, Marxism was still alive. I won't say it was thriving, but yes, it was already there, but it had already shown that those signs of weakness, and within a few years it was going to collapse. But it was still there, 1979. Marxism had a meta-narrative, that meta-narrative of progress, that meta-narrative that history has an inherent meaning and we are going somewhere, which Marx thought was ultimately a socialist revolution which will come one day and things will become very different from what they are. So not only Christian salvation history is a meta-narrative, but the Marxist narrative, Marxist utopia is a narrative. A time when class distinctions will vanish and we will have what Marx thought was would be an ideal living condition. So Hegelian concept of history is a meta-narrative. Christian salvation history is a meta-narrative. I have not gone into the details of how Hegelian concept is a reinterpretation of the same Christian idea, which was there in Christian salvation history. Hegel, after he died, there was a lot of debate among his students, among his pupils, how to designate Hegel. Was he a Christian philosopher or was he not a Christian philosopher? There were students who interpreted Hegel in one way, the students who interpreted Hegel in another way. But I think now more or less there is a consensus that Hegel is not a Christian philosopher. In fact, Hegel is an atheist because he does not believe in a personal God. He is an atheist but without being a naturalist, because a naturalist would be someone who does not even subscribe to any transnatural reality. or transnatural logic, which Hegel does, because he does believe in absolute, he does believe in mind, he does believe in some kind of principle, some kind of order which is trans-empirical, which is transnatural. So he is not a naturalist. Although, because he does not believe in a personal God like in Abrahamic traditions, you can perhaps safely call him an atheist in that sense. But Marx is an atheist. And for those philosophers who follow Marx, like Nietzsche, they are atheists. Heidegger is an atheist. Anyway, this is another meta-narrative or grand narrative. So modernity is a grand narrative because modernity believed in rationality. Modernity, among other things that modernity believed in, was belief in science and technology. And Lyotard spends a lot of time in explaining the situation of science and technology in postmodern world. What does it do? How does it work? And this is a time when internet was still not there. And I don't know what he would have written, what we would have done if he had seen internet. So it is incredulity towards all meta-narratives, says Lyotard, simplifying to the extreme. And all those meta-narratives which tell us a story about the origin, about the purpose, they are meta-narratives. Lyotard doesn't mean that we are living in an age where these meta-narratives have vanished. No, they have not vanished. They have not disappeared. They still are there. What he means to say is that they have lost that force, that power that they had a century or two ago. Okay? Otherwise, another important thing that is debated, how do you look at those thinkers who had predicted the gradual disappearance of religion? This is something which is central to the modern prophets of modernity. People like, for example, Freud and even Marx, and sociologists like Kant, Weber, many other people who were writing at that time in the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. They were sure that religion will one day disappear. And they gave their own views about it. Freud had his own understanding of it. Marx had his own understanding of it. Kant and others, they had their own understanding, their own interpretation of why that would happen. But one common thing was that religion offers us a prop. It offers us some kind of support, an emotional support, which is not grounded in reality. Once we have knowledge, there will be no reason for that prop to exist. So we will shed off those props and then we will be on our own. It did not happen and is unlikely to happen. But we are not going into that problem here. Okay, so let me come to this. Talking of philosophy, what was the traditional concept of philosophy that postmodernism rejects? One was that philosophy is universal. Metaphysics is universal. It is not context bound because it reflects man's absolute thirst or quest for the ultimate knowledge, the first principles. Philosophy, by definition, according to them, has to be context free, and it has to provide some final and absolute explanations. But postmodernism says that there is no such thing as that. All philosophical thinking is context bound. All kinds of thinking is context bound. And everything is an interpretation. Now we'll come to this point, which is central to postmodern thinking, because this separation between fact and its interpretation, it comes for a special attack in postmodernism. starting with Nietzsche, who actually very strongly criticized this idea that we can somehow grasp facts without interpretations. But keep this in mind, we'll take this up later on. So, let me go to some historical background, because I said that for me postmodernism in this philosophical sense is nothing new, except that it is more radical. It is a reworking of those ideas which were there in ancient times, in ancient Greeks, in medieval times. Everybody knows that there was this idea of what you call impossibility of knowing things as they really are. I'm reminded of some people in ancient Greece. Have you heard of Pyrrho or Pyrrho, who lived between 360 and 270 BC? Greek philosopher. If you have to identify one of the earliest skeptical philosophers, he is one of them. Pyrrho. They say that he is the founder of skepticism. And they also say that he took part in Alexander's expedition to India. And he came to India and he debated some thinkers, some philosophers from India. He is famous for a concept called fallibilism. That is the doctrine of fallibility, meaning that it is impossible to know anything for sure. We cannot know anything for sure. Even trivial things we cannot be sure of. That is why he taught that we should never say that this is black. We should say this appears black to me, because then you are you're taking on board the possibility that you might be wrong. Philosophical concepts, they have a very serious consequences for practical and ethical life. For Pyrrho and his disciples, this had a direct influence on how we live. And he actually argued for what he called a complete suspension of action. Sometimes it is, this is called ataraxia. It's a Greek word, Ataraxia, which is to say that you suspend your judgment about everything. You can see that this has also inspired and influenced some thinkers like Schopenhauer, even Buddha, and in as far as this ethical idea is concerned. But even before Pyrrho, there were sophists in Greece. These sophists were people who thought that truth cannot be known. And whatever we say about truth is a construction, is an interpretation of truth. That is why you see that Plato spends a lot of time in critiquing the sophists. Because sophists, they were a threat to how Plato looked at things. We say that Plato is the first great systematic philosopher, and he is the first great systematic philosopher of the Western world. Unlike his teacher Socrates, whose focus was almost exclusively ethical, because Socrates did not build a system. He was an ethical teacher. Plato built a system, and a complete, rigorous, rational philosophical system. In that rational philosophical system, he had to take into account the existence of sophists What were sophists doing? They were his contemporaries. These were the people who were telling philosophers that you are wasting your time because you are running after truth that does not exist. On the contrary, these sophists said that all that matters is persuasion. All that matters is rhetoric. What is rhetoric? It is the art of persuasion. And art of persuasion had a very important place in ancient Greece, especially the political life. If you wanted to be a senator, you had to be a public influencer, and you had to persuade people to vote for you, and you could then use your articulation to make your case. Okay. So what sophists did, for example, this man is the measure of all things. Do you know what it means? It doesn't mean what we think or what we often think it means. It is a statement used by Protagoras, a sophist, to say that there is no standard outside the human standard. Something quite contrary to what Plato was teaching. Plato was teaching that human flourishing, human fulfillment lies in understanding the absolute in everything, absolute in reality, absolute in ethics, absolute in everything, and to live according to the demands of that absolute. And sophists were saying there is no such absolute. In fact, how you look at things, that is what ultimately matters. Plato thought that this is cynical, this is dangerous, this has to be defeated. And that's why you see in his dialogues he is referring to the sophists, to the superficiality of their arguments. And he has many arguments which unfortunately I don't have time to go into, but one thing I will say here, which is that Plato is very, he somehow knows that if sophists are allowed to have their say, what ultimately will happen, that will ultimately cause the obfuscation of truth. And for Plato, it was a real danger that truth can be obfuscated. Now you see, all philosophy must be read as one single novel, according to me, with different chapters. Because what Nietzsche is going to say in the 19th century is connected to what Plato says about language. What Derrida says in the 20th century is connected to what Nietzsche has said, what Heidegger has said, and what Plato has said. So keep these connections in mind. What is Plato aware of? And this is something that Nietzsche and later on Derrida will talk about. That Plato in his dialogues seems to be aware of the fact that he does not want to admit that while using language he is already playing with fire. Now let me try to explain what that means. Plato, we know, banished all poets, and in Republic we know why he did so, because poetry does not tell us the truth, and it nourishes our passions, our emotions and all that. But there is a more fundamental problem there, which is that poetry somehow creates the so-called meaning in poetry by using language not the way it is to be used, but in a way that it should not be used. Let me explain. Language is a necessity. We cannot work without language. Communication will not be possible without language. But Plato says that language is to be used circumspectly, carefully, cautiously, because within language lie traps. If we somehow are not aware of those traps, then language has the capacity to create a semblance of truth without actually creating truth. That is to say that the task of language is purely symbolical or representational. It is simply a tool by means of which we should grasp an extra linguistic reality. That is what language is meant for. But language also has an inherent, there is a danger lying within language, that it can create an impression of reality without giving us reality. That is when we do not know how to use language, when we do not use language as a means to an end, which is the communication of a concept, but when we somehow welter in the mire of language, if I could use this poetic metaphor, when we somehow revel in language itself without taking into cognizance the dangers lying in language. This insight comes from Plato. While using language, beware, because you are using a tool that cuts both ways. It can give you a knowledge of truth, but it can also obfuscate that truth. And this is precisely what sophists were saying, that yes, that's what we are doing. We are using language as a means of persuasion, not as a means to attain some truth, some goal. Plato thought that this was dangerous. Language must only be used minimally, the way philosophers use it. It should never be used the way poets use it, who somehow enjoy the use of language. They use metaphors. Though this concept of metaphor is central in postmodernism, because it is linked both to Derrida and Nietzsche. Before Derrida, it's linked to Nietzsche. Okay, so we have covered sophists somewhat. There is nothing absolute. There is nothing outside the human perspective. Man is the measure of all things, which is, which is saying something similar to what Nietzsche would say in his perspectivism in the 19th century. And then the idea of the language as inherently metaphorical. Then there were other skeptics. Although skepticism was not a dominant, you could say, feature of medieval philosophy. When René Descartes arrived on the scene in the modern, René Descartes is called the first modern philosopher, 17th century René Descartes. He is also called the founder of rationalism. In fact, three great rationalists of that age were all geniuses. René Descartes, Leibniz, the great German philosopher, mathematician, and the third one? Who was the third one? Spinoza. The three great rationalists of that age. But we will not talk of Leibniz. Is not studied much today, but undoubtedly he was one of the greatest minds ever. Not only that because he was a philosopher, but he was many things also. He invented calculus separately from Newton. Newton had already done it independently, but Leibniz also did it independently. And he was a great Christian philosopher. His works on theodicy are still read and they have still great importance. Anyway, let me talk of Descartes. Descartes said that Descartes' central problem was that how to defeat skepticism. Doubt seems to be assailing us from all sides. And no philosophy can even begin to take the first step unless it takes into account the fact that everything is to be doubted. This is, if you ask any philosopher that how did modern philosophy start, everyone perhaps would say that modern philosophy started when philosophers said that, come on, let us doubt everything, because everything is to be doubted. And Marx when Marx's daughter asked him, Father, what is the greatest gift that God has given man? Marx said, doubt. Doubt Now, if you doubt, then what is that you doubt, and what is that you can doubt, and what is that what you should not doubt? Descartes says it, let me doubt everything. Even this supposedly indubitable fact that there is a physical universe outside me. He said that perhaps there is a demon who has constructed these images for me, and the demon is interested in constantly deceiving me. How do I know that there is no demon outside who has created this world for me, which is not a real world? So he starts with doubts everything, but then he says that, can I affirm anything? And his conclusion is, yes, I can affirm something. Cogito. That is the foundation of his philosophy. The self. The self cannot be doubted, because even in the act of doubting the self has to be. I think, therefore I am, because in order to think, I have to be. That is, in order to doubt my existence, I have to be. It is not very often understood correctly, but we will not go into that because that will take a lot of time. So, for Descartes, certitude begins with this self. If I am able to prove that I exist, and he thought that he could prove that, he says that this will not be the end of this. Descartes' philosophy begins with the affirmation of the self, but it does not stop there. He goes on to affirm many other things, including God, moving step by step. While this was going on in France, in the continental tradition, this is what we call modern philosophy. Modern philosophy, it has currents like rationalism of these people, of Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz. It has empiricism, British empiricism, the two main philosophical currents of the age. And then there is the synthesis of empiricism and rationalism in Immanuel Kant. Okay. Before Kant, there arises a philosopher by the name of David Hume. Since I am talking about doubt. David Hume is an empiricist, so he doubts everything. And he says that I cannot affirm the existence of anything. It's just a matter of habit that we believe in certain things. For example, the human self, that is doubted by Hume. Causality is doubted by Hume. And almost everything is doubted by Hume. But again, sorry, because there is no time to explain what Hume is doing. Just to sum it up for you, which is that Hume's philosophy ends in a kind of skepticism that even threatens science. Hume very famously criticizes causality, the cause and effect relationship. And his argument is that we cannot affirm any connection between the so-called cause and the so-called effect. It is only by a mental habit, because we see two things happening together in quick succession, that we posit a connection between cause and effect. True to his principles, he's right there. If we accept those empirical principles of David Hume, then we have to doubt causality, because cause is not something that can be empirically verified. Cause is something that human mind constructs as an explanation between two events which happen out in time, which are contiguous in time and space, which happen together in time and space. That's what we call cause. It's similar to what Ghazali had done many centuries ago. In his Tahafa, he had launched a devastating critique against philosophers. And one of the things that he had said, although in a different context, his context was that philosophers, by which he means the Muslim philosophers, not the Greek philosophers, the Muslim philosophers who were influenced by Greek philosophers, like Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina. These were the philosophers who were using philosophical understanding to interpret the scripture, the Islamic scripture. And one of the things that they did is that they said that miracles are scientifically impossible. So miracles have to be explained in a scientific manner. You can see something similar happening in 19th century here in India when Sir Sayyid Ahmad Khan writes his tafsir. If you look at his tafsir and if you see how he interprets miracles, you will see that he is trying to give a scientific explanation for those miracles which obviously cannot be explained from a scientific perspective. But he tries to give a scientific explanation that this is not supernatural intervention, this is a natural phenomenon which can be explained in natural terms. So what philosophers like Farabi and Ibn Sina were doing, they were saying that miracles have to be understood in a different way, not in the literal way that traditionalists ask us to understand. Of course, this was based on the concept of causality. The concept of causality. What is causality? Causality is the idea that the world, the universe is actually regulated by certain fixed laws. One of the fixed, immutable laws is that of causality. That is, one thing necessarily and universally leads to another thing. For example, fire leads to burning. There is a necessary connection between fire and burning. This was seen as a fact that nobody could deny because this was obvious. Ghazali attacked this proposition. He said that no, there is no natural connection between fire and burning. He did his own arguments, similar to what David Hume would say many centuries after, but of course with differences as well. In comes Kant after Hume, and he says that if we do not save knowledge from Humean skepticism, knowledge is in danger. Therefore, Kant steps in and he gives a different interpretation of causality. He agrees with Hume, this is a bit philosophical, he agrees with Hume that you cannot affirm causality as an empirical fact out there. His solution is that causality is one of the conceptual categories by means of which we put the different things of the phenomenon together. We bind them together. That does not mean they do not have a universality and necessity. They still have a universality and necessity because all world is actually a construction of human mind. So Kant's philosophy, although it does answer human skepticism in his own way, but ultimately it is a turn towards subjectivism. It's a turn towards subjectivism in this way because Kant is telling us that we can never know the world as it is. We can only know the world as it is created by our conceptual categories. This is what we call the inner turn. This is what we call the subjective turn in philosophy. So, although Kant is a great philosopher, but his great philosophy comes at a price from one perspective. That the cost is that the world does exist, but it only exists insofar as we create it through our mental apparatus. We can never know the world as it really is. We can never know the phenomena. We can never know the nomina. We can only know the phenomena. Okay? So what I'm telling you is that skeptical streak comes back in one way or the other. Kant is answering Hume's skepticism, but he is still a skeptic in a way. Because all that he can affirm is that, yes, we can be sure about certain things about this phenomenal world. We can never be sure about the most important things that matter to humans. That is, we can never be sure about God, we can never be sure about immortality, we can never be sure about freedom, we can never be sure about these great metaphysical questions. It is true that Kant's agnosticism cuts both ways. his agnosticism is a critique both of the theists as well as the atheist, because his conclusion finally is that reason is simply incapable of saying anything about these matters. Reason cannot give its judgment regarding whether God exists or not, whether freedom is there or not, whether immortality is there or not. The three great metaphysical questions. Now, how much time do I have?
5 minutes.
Just 5 minutes. Oh, okay.
It's a 1 hour lecture series.
Okay. So I think I should conclude because I cannot say anything in 5 minutes. But we can continue with this series if you like it, that is depending on your feedback. And we can talk about what happens in this history subsequently after Kant, because we have not even begun to talk about the major precursors to postmodernism, which begins with Nietzsche. So in the next lecture, I will be talking sharing something about Nietzsche. I think I will stop here. Thank you.